So today we're going to talk about how to start a drone program for your police or fire department. When you start thinking about putting a drone program together, there are 4 things that you really need to consider. The first is what type of equipment you're going to purchase. The second is what kind of training you need to do. You also have to consider what type of FAA authorization you're going to do, and then think through your SOPs. So let's take them one by one, and then we'll have in-depth videos on each one of these sections so you can get more idea of what you're looking for. So first, let's talk about equipment. The big thing that you need to think about when you're going into an equipment purchase is, do I need thermal imaging or not? If you don't need thermal imaging, there are a lot less expensive options. You can get small ones, big ones that are low price and high price, just depending on your use cases. But if you don't need the thermal imaging, you have a lot more choices. If you do need a thermal imaging camera, you basically have 2 options. You've got the Mavic 2 Enterprise Dual, which is about $3,000, or you've got the Matrice 200 series, which ranges somewhere from the $10,000 to $25,000 range, depending on the size of thermal camera you need and what other sensors you need as well. So on the equipment front, those are basically your options. There is some new stuff coming out from other providers like Autel, Unique, and of course Flyability makes some specialized drone equipment. Those are sort of the outliers at this point. We'd love to see them get to be more in the mainstream, but right now it's sort of DJI for most people. So that's your equipment purchases. Then you have to start thinking about what kind of training you're going to do. So the really important thing to remember here is that you absolutely have to have good training before you start a drone program. It's not enough to just go buy a drone and start flying it. You have to know what you're doing. I always say it's like if somebody gives you a remote control car and you go take it out on the highway, you would never do that. So that's exactly what you're doing here with the drone program. You're putting an airplane up in the national airspace, and you need to understand how to do that safely. So when we talk about training, we've got all kinds of different training courses here at Skyfire. There are plenty of other training providers out there, but the most important thing to know is you have to have at least a day of ground school and a day of flight school. So the things that we cover in ground school are things like understanding the different types of airspace classification, understanding weather products and what you need to know, understanding what the FAA calls aeronautical decision making, so how to use all the information you have at your fingertips to make a good decision, and then things like aeromedical factors. What's going to make you a less safe pilot if you haven't eaten, or if you're taking medication, or if you've been drinking alcohol. So those are the kinds of things that the ground school should cover. As far as the flight school, you need to cover things like basic maneuvers, taking the drone out, turning it on, pre-flighting the aircraft, lifting it off the ground, doing basic maneuvers, landing, putting it away. Then you also want to get into some of the more advanced things, like how do you do box patterns, or different like the NIST course props, and we'll talk about that more in a future video, but things that you can use to simulate real-world environments and practice with the drone doing that, rather than just putting it up, spinning it around, putting it back in the box, and going on about your way. So if you're interested in training, of course, we're going to have a separate video on that. We offer several different kinds of training classes here at Skyfire, everything from a 1-day Part 107 training all the way up to a 5-day integration into law enforcement class. So all kinds of options for you there. So that's training. Let's talk about FAA authorization. This is definitely going to require a more in-depth video here, but the basic framework is there are 2 ways for you to get certified as a public safety operator to fly a drone in the national airspace. The first one is under the Part 107 certification. The second one is under what's called a Certificate of Authorization. So let's talk about Part 107 first. Part 107 is the Commercial Operators Framework, and what you need to do there is you need to be responsible for taking a 60-question written test. You have to get at least a 70% on that test, and it's valid for 2 years. If you get the Part 107's certification, it allows you to fly during daylight hours only in Class G or uncontrolled airspace, below 400 feet above ground level, and then within line of sight. So the operator needs to actually be able to see the drone itself. Now, of course, you can get waivers for all of those things. So you can ask to fly in controlled airspace, and there's a process for that. You can ask to fly at nighttime, and there's a process for that as well. But that's the basics of 107. On the Certificate of Authorization side, you have 2 basic types of COAs. The first one is called the Blanket COA, and that allows you to fly in the entire continental US as long as you are in uncontrolled airspace. Typically, we see agencies starting with the Blanket COA because it gets approved relatively quickly. The second type is the Jurisdictional COA. So the Jurisdictional COA covers you for your entire jurisdiction regardless of the type of airspace. So if you have any kind of airport in your jurisdiction, you're going to want that Jurisdictional COA. But it's only good for your area. So there's a third type of COA called the SGI, or the Emergency COA, and we've already done a video on how to fill one of those out. But that video, that process will actually show you how to get approval to fly outside of your jurisdiction, but in controlled airspace. And that involves calling Washington and getting approval, and it usually takes an hour or less. So those are the two different types of COA, and we talked about 107. The big differences between the two are that Part 107, you as the pilot are electing to do the flight, not the department itself. Under the COA, it is the department that's electing to operate that program, and so the thought is that the liability would go to the department rather than the individual operator. Of course, it's important to point out that this has not been tested in court yet, so we don't know for sure what would happen, but this is the current thinking. Now, there's an important distinction between 107 as a certification and 107 as an operating framework. 107 as a certification, love it, it's awesome. As an operating framework, it's a little limiting because you need to get waivers for all the controlled airspace, the nighttime, and flight over people. Under the COA, you get all that stuff ahead of time. So you get your waiver to fly in controlled airspace, you get a waiver to fly at night built into the COA, and you also get the ability to fly over people in an emergency. One thing I want to point out about the COA that is super important to remember is not every public safety mission is going to be a COA mission. The COA missions are reserved for things that are actually public safety functions. So if you're chasing a suspect, fighting a fire, serving a warrant, things like that. If you're doing things like filming video of a parade or just doing generic training video, those may not fall under the COA, and you would need to have a Part 107 to operate those flights. So the current thinking from the FAA is that go ahead and get a COA. It's the best way to operate your program, but don't forget you should also probably get a 107 certification so you have that as a backup if you need it. All right, so that was the FAA section. Of course, there's going to be a lot more information on those things in our COA versus 107 video. The final thing I want to point out for you to think about is standard operating procedures. These are going to differ from department to department, but some of the things you want to start thinking about are, what are we going to do with our data? Are we going to keep it? Do we keep it for a day, a week, a month, a year? Those are the kinds of things that you need to talk with your district attorney about records retention and Freedom of Information Act requests. Of course, data security is another thing you want to figure out. Whether or not you're going to use various software for keeping track of your pilot logs and other things. And then really the use cases and identifying when you're going to use the drone, when you're not going to use the drone, and what specific use cases call for it, who's going to authorize that use, things like that. So those are the 4 different parts of starting a drone program. Again, how to pick the right equipment, how to choose the right training, how to decide whether you're going to go COA or Part 107 or both, and then how to develop SOPs. So that'll do it for this episode. Again, we're going to have detailed videos on all of these things, but in the meantime, thank you so much for watching, and we'll talk to you next time.